very surprised to see and happy to see so many people. And in the name of Secomania, I must say that we're very thrilled also to bring this conference to you. We haven't done this very often, and it's kind of a first for us. So the Secomania, I'll remind you for those who do not know, is the Society of Students in Economics at the University of Neuchâtel. And we are happy to invite you to this conference, in which we will discuss the economic impacts of the recent American elections. So it goes without saying that these results, notably the upcoming term of President-elect Donald Trump, will have quite far-reaching implications, not only societally and environmentally, but especially economic. And therefore, we're very happy to have two great economists come and share their expertise on this topic. So these two economists are Guido Baldi and Kaufmann. Our first speaker is Mr. Baldi. He's a macroeconomist at the University of Bern, at the German Institute for Economic Research, and DIY in Berlin, where he's also an expert on the world economy and on specific topics related to especially the German economy. He has expertise in economic policy, in international macroeconomics, and he studied economics at the University of Bern, Toulouse, Geneva, and received his PhD also from the University of Bern. Our second speaker is Kaufmann. He's professor actually here of applied macroeconomics at the University of Neuchâtel. He's also co-editor at the Swiss Journal for Economics and Statistics, as well as research fellow at the Kaufmann Swiss Economic Institute. His areas of expertise are especially macroeconomics and on topics such as monetary policy and inflation. Mr. Kaufmann studied economics at the bachelor's and master's levels at the University of Bern before receiving his PhD at the University of Bern. So thank you two very much for being here, and I think that we can applaud them. So how will this evening proceed? Basically, we will first have Dr. Baldi's presentation, which will be followed by a quick Q&A session by our very own Secomania moderator, Dimos, right here, who will be happy to take your questions. We will then have Professor Kaufmann's presentation, which will also be followed by a Q&A session, as well as a broader discussion if you guys wish to interject. And finally, we will wrap up with a brief apéro, so feel free to join us downstairs and discuss further if you wish. So thank you all for being here, and I'll hand over the floor to Dr. Baldi.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. It's good to see so many people here. I hope you ordered enough apéro. Obviously, the topic is very relevant. The impact of the American elections on the global and Swiss economies. Obviously, there are a lot of uncertainties right now regarding this second Trump presidency. So let me just sketch some initial thoughts I have regarding the future of the US economy and the global economies. I think one of the few things we already know is that the next 4 years will be quite chaotic. So, and the rest is, I think, quite uncertain right now. Okay, so how will I organize this talk? First, let me show some initial slides regarding the importance of the US economy for the world. And then in the main part, I will sketch two scenarios. One extreme Trump scenario where he will implement everything he promised during the campaign. And the second scenario will be the so-called mild Trump scenario where Trump just implements a few elements of his campaign promises. Hello. Hi. Okay, and then I will end with some conclusions and final remarks. Okay, now, oops. So let me start with this slide here that should illustrate the importance of the US economy for the world. For instance, here you see 25. This means that the US economy accounts for 25% of world output. Okay, so that's the most important economy in the world. It's also quite remarkable, if you follow the curve for the US economy, that the importance of the US economy has remained remarkably stable over the past decades. Okay, that's perhaps surprising to some of you, I don't know, because some people, they think the US economy is in decline or something. Actually, if you look at this figure here, this is not the case. What we see, however, is that the importance of the European economies has decreased, okay, quite a lot, I would say. So here we see a decline. We also see the economic miracle in China. Okay, that's quite impressive. However, we also see that this economic miracle seems to have come to an end recently, and at least the IMF projects that this will remain the case for the next years. Okay, that's quite interesting because some years ago, before the pandemic, some economists predicted that the Chinese economy would converge to the US economy and then later become the world's biggest economy. Now, from today's perspective, you would say, no, this will not happen in the next years. Hi. And then we also see here the slow rise of India. Perhaps that's the beginning of the next economic miracle. And we see here the slight decrease of the importance of the German economy, and also the Swiss economy has slightly reduced its importance. Okay, now I just said that the US economy is the most important economy in the world. At the same time, the United States or US consumers are the most important consumers in the world. And they, I simplify a bit, they consume so many goods that they have to import a lot of goods from other countries. And because they have to import so many goods from other countries, the United States runs a trade deficit. So it imports more goods than it exports. Okay, the trade deficit is quite large, around 3% of GDP on average. And also the bilateral trade deficit just with China is quite large. So that's also an important issue, as we all know, for Donald Trump. He does not like trade deficits. He wants to reduce these trade deficits. Now the question is, of course, will Donald Trump be successful in reducing trade deficits by increasing tariff rates? Here I have my doubts. I mean, let's just have a look at what happened after 2017, 2018, when Trump, during his first presidency, he increased tariffs. Here we see that, well, the bilateral trade deficit with China decreased somewhat, but the overall trade deficit did not decrease. Okay, why? Because, I gotta simplify, if US households decide to spend a lot of money on goods, to have a low savings rate, and if the US government decides to run high budget deficits, then it's almost automatic that there will be a trade deficit. Okay, and in my perspective, tariffs will not change that much for this trade deficit. But I can talk about this later a bit more. Now, I mentioned before that the US has a trade deficit against the world, against China, against many other countries. The US also has a trade deficit against Switzerland. Perhaps it's a bit confusing, sorry. Here it's figure from the perspective of Switzerland, where we see Swiss exports to the United States. Okay, they grew quite fast in the past years, not only but mainly driven by pharmaceutical exports. We also see that imports increased a little bit, but of course by far less than exports. So the trade balance had to increase. Switzerland runs a high trade surplus against the United States. Okay, and yeah, I mentioned before, Donald Trump doesn't like trade deficits, so we should keep in mind that perhaps somewhere in the next 4 years this could become an issue. I don't think that Switzerland is a priority for Donald Trump, but we should keep it in mind that somewhere, this issue of our trade surplus may become an issue. Okay. What is good for Switzerland is that Swiss firms, they also invest a lot in the United States. They are a big investor. I think it's among the 6 biggest investors in the United States, so that's quite impressive. Swiss firms, they have a lot of factories in the United States, and that's something Donald Trump likes because he wants to have factories built in the United States by foreign firms to create jobs and other things. Okay, recently he said that, Donald Trump said, I want German car firms to become American car firms by building factories in America and creating jobs there. Okay, so that's his intention, and because Switzerland already invests quite a lot in the United States, that's good for us. Okay, and this year is also interesting because exports to the United States have increased so much. The United States is now our biggest export market. Yeah. Okay, and it used to be Germany, but the importance of Germany as an export market has steadily decreased over the past years. Okay, now after these introductory remarks, let me sketch 2 scenarios for the Trump presidency. First, an extreme Trump scenario, where, as I said, he will implement everything he promised during his campaign, and a mild Trump scenario where he just implements a few elements of his program. Okay, and this just to be complete, I assume that somehow in any case he will try to reduce regulations. Some of that will be desirable. In general, it's always good to have less regulations, but of course, sometimes it might be at the cost of less environmental protection. Okay. Now, let me talk about 3 areas where Trump made quite strong promises during his campaign. First, regarding trade policy, here he announced that he will increase tariff rates to 10 or even 20% for all imports from all countries. Okay, and a second promise was that he wants to increase tariffs from China to 60%. Okay, this would be quite dramatic, one can say. Then regarding immigration policy, he announced that he wants to conduct deportations of unauthorized immigrants up to around 10 million people, so quite a lot. I mean, in general, when I will talk about that on a few slides, these people will just be numbers, but we should always bear in mind that we talk about human beings that are now at risk of being deported. And the last point is tax and fiscal policy, or just fiscal policy perhaps. Here, Trump announced to reduce corporate tax rates to 15%. During his first presidency, he had already decreased the corporate tax rate from, I think, 45% to 21%, and now he wants to do the same and decrease tax rates from 21% to 15%. And he also announced some other income tax reductions, but I think they are less relevant. Okay. Now, regarding tariff policy, by the way, do you know that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary? That's what Donald Trump said once during his campaign. I don't think they are so beautiful because tariffs are basically a tax on imports, and usually taxes means high inflationary pressures. And in the United States, of course, it could be that the dollar appreciates a bit, then this would make imports cheaper again. Okay, so inflationary pressures would be reduced somewhat. It could also be that exporters from other countries, like Germany, would say, okay, I have to decrease my profit margin because of these new taxes. So some of the tax would be shifted to the German exporters. However, in general, I could nevertheless assume that tariffs, higher taxes, increase prices and lead to at least somewhat inflationary pressures. Does not have to be necessarily higher actual inflation. This will depend on the central bank. But nevertheless, inflationary pressures can be assumed to increase with tariffs. And usually, we would also assume that higher taxes, higher tariffs are associated at least with somewhat lower economic growth. An important question then will be, will other countries retaliate? Okay, so if Donald Trump says, tomorrow I will increase my tariffs for German cars to 20%, what will Germany do? Will they also increase their tariffs for US imports? Or in this case, the European Union will decide for Germany. So this is an important question. Will other countries retaliate and also increase their tariffs in response to higher tariffs from the United States? Okay, in this case, of course, let's say a vicious cycle of higher tariffs everywhere, with higher inflation, and probably lower welfare could be the result. Again, in this extreme case, Trump scenario. Okay, now let's go to the numbers. Here I show you some simulations by economists from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in the United States. I mean, at the moment, a lot of economists, they present all kinds of simulations to try to estimate the effects of these tariffs and so on. There are a lot of uncertainties, a lot of assumptions one has to make. So perhaps it's a good idea not to pay too much attention to the particular numbers here. But let's say the qualitative pattern, I think, is quite intuitive. What we see here is that if Trump adopts these 10% tariffs, then the closest trading partners of the United States will be very negatively affected. These are Mexico and Canada. Okay, the neighbor countries. These are the closest trading partners. The United States itself would also be quite negatively affected in economic terms. And some other countries, like Germany, they would also feel some negative effects, but it doesn't seem to be that dramatic, at least from this figure here. And I would guess that for Switzerland, the curve would be similar as this curve for Germany. Okay, so negative effects, but for Germany and Switzerland, but probably not the end of the world. Okay, now this was the case without retaliation, where we assume that Trump just increases his tariffs and the other countries, they do nothing. Of course, it's more realistic to assume that other countries would retaliate, so they would also increase their tariffs for American exports. Okay, the European Union and Switzerland will say, okay, now we increase our tariffs for American cars, whatever. And in this case, we see that the negative effects, this is now just for the United States, would be much higher with retaliation. Okay, and we can assume that probably also for other countries, the negative effects would increase quite considerably. Okay, so also for Germany and Switzerland, the negative effects of this trade war would be quite high. Now if we go to these proposed tariffs on Chinese imports, okay, I said Trump announced that he will increase tariffs on all Chinese imports to 60%. Okay, this would be quite dramatic, one can say. And in this case, well, it's not surprising that China would be severely hit by these tariff increases. We'd see quite dramatic economic damages. There would also be negative effects for the US economy, obviously. But then, interestingly, some other countries would even gain from such a bilateral tariff for Chinese imports. Okay, I mean, you can say if the United States imports less goods from China because of these tariffs, it will import more goods from Germany or Canada, Mexico. Okay, so this quite an interesting pattern here. For in the case of bilateral tariffs just for China, some countries would even gain, at least according to these simulations.
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder?
Ah, sorry, yeah. Okay, so it's quite interesting. Some countries would even gain from these tariffs, perhaps also Switzerland. For Switzerland, there are now also some economists trying to estimate the economic damage of such tariffs. And for example, here, these economists from the ETH in Zurich, they estimate that tariffs, they use 20% tariffs on all imports from Switzerland to the United States, that this would cost each person in Switzerland 200 Swiss francs, or 0.2% of Swiss GDP. That's significant, but again, it would not be the end of the world, if true. Okay, so these were my remarks regarding the tariffs. Now let me talk a bit about deportations of so-called unauthorized immigrants, so people who enter the United States in some illegal way, you can say, mostly across the border, Mexico, United States. And according to some reports, this would be up to around 10 million people who could be deported. I think the actual number would be considerably lower, but that's the extreme case, 10 million people. And as I mentioned before, obviously we're talking here about human beings, so this has a social dimension. We should bear this in mind. We are talking here about people, not just numbers. But nevertheless, for this presentation, let us focus on the pure economic effects. Now, if you look at the United States, and you take 10 million people away, 10 million workers away from the country, then of course we'll have a lower labor supply. Less workers will be there in the United States. And so this will have dampening effect on economic growth. Okay. I mean, if you took, I don't know, 500,000 people away from Switzerland, this would also have some immediate damage for the Swiss economy. At the same time, I could expect that the wages for the remaining workers or people there could increase at least a little bit because of worker shortages. Okay, if you take these 10 million people away, worker shortages will occur. That's quite obvious, and then you would expect somewhat higher wages. It might also lead to somewhat higher labor force participation of the people in the United States. So some people who currently do not work, they will see higher wages and they will say, okay, now I can go to the labor market because now it's beneficial for me to work. However, I don't think that this will, a lot of people will do that, so it will not fully compensate for the loss of workers from deportations. So worker shortages might also occur. Okay, and because wages could increase at least somewhat, it is also conceivable that inflation, or at least inflationary pressures, will be higher. Okay, if you increase wages, then people have more money, they will spend it, and in the end, firms will also try to increase prices a little bit, so this creates somewhat inflationary pressures. Again, this doesn't mean that actual inflation will increase. This will depend on the central bank, but one could say that inflationary pressures at least will be somewhat higher. Okay. Now, this was just the supply side in the United States. Let me also talk about the demand side. If you take 10 million people away from the United States, there will be less consumption in the United States, so less demand in the economy. And if you have less demand in the economy, of course, this somehow hurts the economy, dampens economic growth, and dampens also inflationary pressures, because if people do not buy goods and services, then firms will try to reduce their prices in order to get customers. Okay, so what one could say here for the US economy, deportations will have clearly a negative effect on GDP. Now, if you talk here about the effects of the US policy decisions on the world economies, then one can say that probably these effects will be quite low, at least for Switzerland and Europe, but I guess for some smaller countries, at least in Central America and probably also Mexico, it could be quite significant. Because a lot of these 10 million people, they come from Mexico or some smaller nations in Central America. Okay, and this intuition is confirmed by these simulations, by the same authors I showed before. They find that if millions of people are deported from the United States, they use the number 8.3 millions, then US GDP would drop by almost 8%. I said before, we should not pay too much attention to the particular numbers, but nevertheless, it's quite impressive that the economic damage, if this is true, could potentially be quite large for the US economy. And other economies are not that much affected as expected. Okay, now let me also talk about fiscal policy. Here, Trump proposed corporate tax cuts. He wants to reduce the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. Of course, tax reductions tend to boost corporate investment and also economic output in general, but one should not expect a boom. I mean, there were several studies done after the tax cuts by Trump in 2017 or 18, and all these studies, they found a significant positive effect on the economy by these tax cuts, but these effects were not that large. Okay, so of course tax cuts usually foster economic growth, investment, but at least in this case I would not expect a big boom. But of course, if you decrease tax rates, you will have less tax revenues, so the budget deficit of the government will increase, and also public debt will increase. Now, of course, in the last days, I heard some Republicans proposing ideas to cut spending. Of course, then the budget deficit would not increase that much. But at the moment, we don't really know what Trump will do. So for the moment, I just assume he will implement these tax cuts, no spending cuts, so the budget deficit will increase. Okay. So in the end, we can say this would lead to somewhat stronger growth in the US. And we can also assume at least some positive spillover effects to other countries, for instance, through higher imports. Okay, if there is stronger growth in the US, people in general earn more money, they have more money to spend, and some of this money will be spent on imports, perhaps for Swiss watches or German cars. But again, not a huge effect, but a small positive spillover effect can be expected. But what I want to show you now is this impressive figure, I think. It shows us the evolution of public debt in the United States, or debt of the federal government. So it is projected to increase anyway, okay, to 125% in 10 years. And now if Donald Trump implements all his campaign promises, then these economists here predict that public debt will be considerably higher. Okay. So, I mean, we should not expect a debt crisis or something in the United States, but of course, higher public debt is always somehow a problem. The government has to spend a lot of money just on interest payments, so there will be less funds available for other purposes, and so on. Okay, so these were some scenarios for this extreme Trump case, where he adopts everything he promised. Now, let me just sketch a scenario mild Trump, where I assume that Donald Trump will fully adopt his corporate tax cuts. I think here he has really also a majority among Republicans in the Senate and in the House. So I think he will be able to do that. We can also expect that regulations will be reduced. As I said before, some of these reduced regulations will be desirable, of course. Some others are perhaps less desirable because they come at the cost of less environmental protection or other things. And then assume that Trump will impose some additional tariffs, particularly for China, but I do not expect the full implementation of the proposed tariff hikes on Europe and Switzerland, perhaps only on some special goods. I think he will mainly use his tariff threats to negotiate some advantages for the US economy and the US in general. But I might be wrong, of course, so please ask questions afterwards during the discussion. And what I also assumed is that some of these unauthorized immigrants will be deported, but I would say a much lower number than these 10 million that are proposed. Okay, and in such a scenario, it could be, I think, that the US economy might perform slightly better than previously expected. Okay, because Trump will implement tax cuts, less regulations, and all the negative things for the US economy, tariffs, deportations, will only be partially adopted. And in this case, I think it's quite conceivable that the US economy might perform slightly better than previously expected. At the same time, all these policies tend to be at least somewhat inflationary. So the central bank of the United States, the Fed, might keep interest rates at least somewhat higher than previously expected. And I would also assume some significant negative effects on the global economy, also on the Swiss economy, but I don't think that these measures will be the end of the world, because these tariffs will only be partially implemented, at least for Switzerland and Europe. Okay, but of course, I mean, the Trump presidency will further foster geoeconomic and geopolitical fragmentation, and so many firms will further try to reorganize their supply chains, move out of China, go to Vietnam, Mexico, Eastern Europe, other countries, and of course all these reorganizations of supply chains are associated with higher costs for the economy, and could also lead to somewhat higher prices here in Switzerland for at least some goods. Okay, now, I mean, it's always nice if I can present some numbers. Here I just used the IMF forecasts from October, so before the election. They're given by this column here. So for the world, they forecast a growth rate of 3.2% for next year. Here, United States, 2.2%. The euro area is weaker, as we know, just a growth rate of 1.2%. And Germany, here also a very low growth rate. We know Germany has big challenges ahead. Economically and politically, so here only weak growth in Germany, a bit higher in Switzerland, and China, despite the end of the Chinese economic miracle, nevertheless would experience a nice growth rate of 4.5% if the numbers are true. Now, let me just sketch some adjustments to these forecasts for next year. Under this scenario, mild Trump. Here I would say the world economy will see some damage from higher tariffs, costs of supply chain reorganizations, and so on. The US economy could even see a slight gain because of these corporate tax cuts and less regulations. And the other economies, here I just assume that they would experience some slight economic damage because of these higher tariffs and so on. Okay, and for China here, I'm not sure. I mean, I think here the Chinese economic growth rate will depend on whether the government will adopt fiscal stimulus plans. Okay, everyone assumes that if Trump will hike its tariffs for China to 60% or so, then the Chinese government would adopt a big fiscal stimulus plan to help the economy. And if this is the case, then growth could be even remain at 4.5%, who knows? But if there is no fiscal stimulus plan, then I would expect considerable economic damage. Okay, now, so already the conclusions. So let me conclude. In an extreme case, I would say that Donald Trump, if he implements the full version of his campaign promises, this would have severe negative effects on the US economy, but also on the world economy, including Switzerland. In a mild scenario, which I hope is the more realistic one, Donald Trump will not implement the full version of his campaign promises, and in this case, I would even expect minor positive effects on the US economy and perhaps small negative effects on the rest of the world because of some higher tariffs and so on, and more uncertainty regarding international relations. Okay, and in any case, I would argue that the political decisions of the US president, they will further contribute to geopolitical and geoeconomic fragmentation. Okay, that's a process that is going on. China and the United States as the big geopolitical rivals. Then we have Russia, this war in Ukraine. We don't really know how Russia will develop in the next years. We have India, countries like Turkey or Brazil, who want to somehow stay independent and at the same time become economically more powerful. So it seems to be that we are entering a world where we have this geoeconomic fragmentation, not just two blocks led by United States and China, but a lot of different countries like Brazil, India, Turkey, and so on. And all these countries want to play their own important role in the world. Now, in all this, what are the challenges for Europe and Switzerland? Just one more slide on that, because I think it's important that in Europe and Switzerland we increase productivity growth to be able to cope with all the challenges we now face. We have the demography, okay, more older people, we have to finance retirement, we have to finance additional defense spending in Europe. Then climate change is also here. Okay, a very important topic that is really challenging for us. And let me show you why we should increase productivity growth in Europe. Okay, so economic output per hours worked. Let me show you why. Here we see for the United States the evolution of labor productivity in the past decades. Then here the same for the euro area. And you see productivity in the euro area is much lower than in the United States. So if we could increase our productivity growth, we would be, let's say, richer, and we would have more money to finance all our challenges, from defense to climate change, demographic change, all these things. In Switzerland, we are somehow in a good position because our productivity is very high, mostly due to our very productive pharmaceutical sector. But we also see that the gap to the rest of the countries has decreased in the past decades. So it's also for Switzerland very important to try to increase productivity growth, to maintain our level of welfare, and to finance all the challenges we face. Okay, and yes, this was the last slide. Thank you very much.
What do you think about the US free trade agreement that Switzerland wants?
Yeah, people talk now about this to somehow revive this free trade agreement and try to conclude another one with the United States. I think they ended it. They didn't even start negotiations during the first Trump presidency, and now some people, they say, let's do it again. Yeah, who knows? Could be successful. However, in all these free trade agreements, the agricultural sector is always a big issue. And I'm quite sure the United States would like to have lower tariffs from Switzerland on US agricultural products. They would like to export their beef and so on to Switzerland. And usually it's politically at least a big problem in Switzerland, so that's not wanted. And if we cannot find an agreement on agriculture with the United States, I guess it will be quite difficult to come to a free trade agreement with the United States. But who knows, perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, I'm not close to this issue, but my guess is that agricultural sector would be important for the United States, and if Switzerland doesn't want to lower its tariffs for agricultural goods from the United States, there will be no treaty. Okay, thank you very much for this question.
You put the GDP on the extreme scenario. You only had the mind, but you put the next to the red one, the extreme scenario.
Yeah, I did not write down numbers because I mean it's in this case it's quite complicated because here you would have to take into account all these retaliations and all these, how can I say, these second round effects. So I did not produce any numbers for that, but we can assume that it will be much lower than that.
So everything will be lower.
Yeah, I mean, in an extreme case, then I could even argue that we would experience, I don't know, a recession or so in Switzerland.
If I may intervene, I would just like to thank you on our part for the great presentation. And if there are any questions from friends, you don't hesitate to ask them, of course. That's why we are here. Or if there are other questions for this section before we continue to the following one. Sure.
Do you have any projections about the inflationary result of those policies? Because most of them look inflationary.
Yeah.
Because they have an extremely high debt. I find it very hard to do anything but lower the rates. You know, we don't have options.
Yes, there will be inflationary pressures, but because Daniel is in charge of inflation today, so you'll present some numbers. So I did not do it in my presentation, sorry, but so let's wait another 20 minutes.
I do have a question. What would be the effect on the forex market and life policy of current presidency? And I'm curious about if we have to expect a strong dollar for the US economy.
So first, for the foreign exchange market, I mean, I'm always a bit, it's always very difficult to predict exchange rates. At the moment, we see a slight appreciation of the US dollar. If the US dollar performs well, and if, let's say, inflation is under control and so on, I would expect that the US dollar will remain rather strong. In a mild scenario, and what happens in an extreme scenario is anyway quite difficult to predict. And then the second part of your question was related more to life, and so yeah, it's, I mean, of course that's not pure economics, but we know that Donald Trump and the Republicans, they have plans somehow to fire some people in the administration, replace them with loyal Republicans, and of course there are also plans to implement other domestic reforms to change, let's say, the social dynamics in the United States. It's difficult to say what will happen. I mean, I will not claim to be an expert on these issues, but certainly we should somehow worry about at least some developments and some announcements that Donald Trump made during his campaign. I mean, some of them sounded quite, how can I say, frightening, worrying, but it's at the moment quite difficult to predict what he will actually implement. But I think also, I'm worried about it.
Actually, I have a question about what you just said. When Trump talks, he talks a lot. He says sometimes very scathing things. It's very difficult to interpret whether he's being serious or not. So, when you're making this presentation, why did you decide to include these factors and not some of the other things?
So well, here I just included some major economic aspects I thought are the most important ones and the ones that would have the most important economic effects. And I mean, as I mentioned before, of course, this election is not just about economics, it's about really social questions. I mentioned it briefly when I talked about deportations. Okay, that's not just a number, it's about human beings. So yeah, here I think it's, if you take a pure economic perspectives, it was, I would say, quite straightforward what to include, because we have it here, trade policy, immigration policy, and fiscal policy, I think, are the most important areas where we can expect decisions. And then all these other things, the social questions, are of course also extremely important, but for this presentation on the economic effects, I did not include them. Thanks. Yes?
Given the Republicans won in the House, the Senate, and presidency, how much more will that facilitate the extreme scenario to become a real scenario?
Of course, it gets somewhat more likely because there are Republican majorities in the parliament. Nevertheless, I would claim that Trump and also many, not every Republican or not every of his followers, but most of his followers are somewhat, can I say, irrational, and I don't think they will want to risk huge economic damage. I mean, regarding deportations, I think they will try to deport some people, and then they will hope that less people will want to enter the United States because the United States is less welcoming to new people. That's their hope, but I don't think that they will deport 8 million people and risk all this economic damage. So that's my main message here. And also, if I here go back to the slide of the tariffs, I don't think Donald Trump and his people want to risk such an economic damage, because Donald Trump is, also during the campaign, he was always proud of having produced a booming economy during his years. Well, it was not that well, perhaps, but at least he wanted, or he wants to claim that I'm the president who produces a booming economy, low unemployment, all these things. And if he implemented all his extreme campaign promises, he would risk not achieving that, and I think he doesn't want that. Sorry?
I have to interrupt you because we're running in time in schedule.
Sure, yeah.
So keep your questions for Dr. Baldi afterwards for the apero, and I will kindly invite Mr. Kaufmann to do his presentation.
All right, so good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for organizing this brilliant event. It's really a great pleasure to have something like that at the University of Neuchâtel, and there should be more of it. So, I just want to say, if we of the Faculty of Economics and Business can be of any help in the future, do not hesitate to contact us. So this is really very much appreciated, and also I'm very happy to contribute this evening. So what I'm going to do is talk about the Trump presidency and the implications for monetary policy and inflation. And primarily, this is not because I think these are maybe the most pressing issues regarding the Trump presidency, but just because this is my main area of expertise, and I hope to give you some additional insights in these topics. So we already have heard that Trump made a couple of campaign promises, and for economic policy, I think these are the most relevant ones, and we already have seen that with Guido Baldi's presentation, that most economists think that these are the policies that potentially have the largest impact on the economy. So on the one hand, we have immigration policy. We already have heard a lot about that. Just to give you another number, I think I heard something like half of people that work in the agricultural sector are actually undocumented immigrants. So basically, you could, for the United States, really a major part of the workforce that contributes to the country actually does not have a specified legal status. Then we heard about tariff policy. So Trump wants to introduce tariffs on imported products in order to reduce the trade deficit. And there, especially China is one object. Then we heard about tax policy. So Trump wants to, on the one hand, extend existing tax cuts, but also introduce some additional tax cuts. And finally, 2 points that have not yet been mentioned to some extent. There is energy policy. So in particular, Trump wants to actually foster the shale oil industry, especially the fracking industry. Just as a reminder, the United States has become actually a net exporter of oil, which is actually quite astounding during the past couple of years due to this fracking revolution. And he actually wants to relax regulation on this sector to actually increase output of oil even further. And finally, security policy. This is, this will have certainly repercussions for economic outcomes, but this is also one of the most difficult areas to make a prediction. So I try to think a little bit about, well, what do these policies imply for inflation in particular? And afterwards, I'm going to talk more about monetary policy. So what is the impact qualitatively on US consumer prices? And here I just kind of outline the main channels that I have in mind. There may be other channels at work that may oppose that, but I think these are the most relevant ones. So first of all, immigration policy, these deportations that we heard about. So of course, this will actually lead to a reduction of the workforce. In the end, if you think about that in terms of what the economy can produce, and if you have a certain demand for goods and services, suddenly you do not have enough workers that actually produce the products that people would like to buy. So this would imply that there is a labor shortage, wages would rise, and therefore you will have, especially for services, but as I said before, probably also for agricultural products, higher prices. Because simply the costs of companies will increase and they will pass that through to consumer prices. And there are a lot of studies that actually exactly show that if you have an increase in wages, usually you will see quite rapidly also an increase in consumer prices. The tariff policy, we already have heard that. Essentially, I would think about that as a tax on imported products. Again, if you add a tax on a product, what companies will do is they pass that on to the consumers. So an increase in the tariff will increase prices for imported products, lead to higher consumer prices. Then tax policy, that's maybe a little bit less obvious, but you could think about, well, if taxes are lower, depends a little bit on whether we talk about taxes on companies or taxes on consumers. But usually what you find if you look at the data is that you have a reduction of taxes. There will be more disposable income in the economy, so people can consume more. This will boost economic activity in isolation, but that risks also an overheating of the economy and potentially also leads to higher prices. Then for energy policy and security policy, I think there the effects are unclear. For energy policy, you could make up a story where you say, well, maybe the increase in oil supply by the United States, that will lead to a reduction of global oil prices. But then again, the question is by how much oil production will further increase in the United States, and how much of that is already priced in oil prices. And security policy, as I said before, it's extremely difficult to anticipate. Clearly, if there is a further escalation of global conflicts, that will certainly lead to higher oil prices that are then again passed through to consumer prices. Now, what's important on this list is that, again, there may be policies that work through, that tends to lower prices, but I think overall, combined policies, if they are implemented, they would imply an increase in prices. Now, the question is, would these policies actually lead to a sustained increase in inflation? So not only one-off increase in the price level, but also continuously increasing prices, so in the growth rate of the price level. Now, this actually now depends on the reaction of the central bank. Those of you that took my second year macro course, they will probably already have heard enough about that. But in the end, the idea is that, well, if you have a central bank that now reacts and tries to stabilize prices, well, maybe then the impact on inflation will not be that important. And here on the top of the slide, I just show you an excerpt of a transcript from the press conference of the US Central Bank, I think on the 7th of November, where a journalist asked the chair of the Federal Reserve whether if Trump asks him to leave, whether he would go, and the chair actually said, no, I will stay in my job. So in the end, the reason why the journalist asked that is that Trump said in the past that, well, actually he doesn't really like the president of the Federal Reserve because he seems to implement a too conservative monetary policy, and probably he thinks that, well, he should be actually replaced. Now, although the Chair Powell says, no, I will not leave, it is important to keep in mind that his term ends in 2026. So anyways, Trump will soon have a say in who will become, or actually can try to influence who will become the next Fed chair relatively soon. However, if you think now about this scenario, which is actually the status quo that we have observed during the past 20 years or so, namely that we have an independent central bank that focuses on price stability, so has an inflation target and adjusts its policy in such a way that inflation remains stable, then even if these policies are inflationary, what we will actually see is that the central bank will increase interest rates. As a side effect, because of higher interest rates, the dollar will appreciate. Economic activity actually will likely suffer in the medium run because in the end, the reason why the central bank can now lower inflation is actually because it accepts a somewhat lower economic growth rate. But in the medium run, inflation will return to the inflation target of the central bank, or at least remain at some acceptable level. So in this scenario, with an independent central bank, which would be my scenario if we actually are in a situation that we experienced during the past 20 years, and actually also was illustrated during the recent surge of inflation where we observed exactly that, well, then I would not expect that we have a sustained increase in inflation. Now, of course, there's a second scenario, exactly because of what Trump said, namely the statement here that I put up from a speech that Trump made during the election, namely that he's convinced that because he's a successful businessman and made a lot of money, actually has a better intuition and instinct what monetary policy is all about, because monetary policy is in the end about money, and he thinks he can deal with money, so actually he has a better instinct than the chairman. And this is exactly what, say, macroeconomists are actually worried about, that we turn to a situation where suddenly the government tries to influence monetary policy decisions of the central bank. Now, this is a situation that we observe in other countries. So we have, for example, the situation in Turkey, where the president basically, if the governor of the central bank does not actually put in place a monetary policy to its liking, he simply replaces this person with another person. So again, like from a legal framework and how the Fed is set up with its federal structure, this is actually not that easy to do in reality, but there is a fear that the government will work to this direction. So this is sometimes called fiscal dominance. So this is a situation where the central bank does not conduct an independent monetary policy anymore, but will actually get will be influenced by the government, and the government does not have as its primary goal to keep inflation low and stable, but rather maybe other goals like finance, government spending, and similar things. So this is the second scenario. In this scenario, the Trump administration would pressure the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, although inflation is actually rising, because this increase in interest rate would actually lead to a strengthening of the dollar, which would be undesirable. But exactly because of that, because interest rates remain low and inflation increases, the dollar will actually weaken in this scenario. Economic activity will still likely suffer in the medium run because, well, this is not the only effect. We have seen these other policies that Guido Baldi talked about. On net, it's still very likely that economic activity will be lower. However, inflation may remain persistently higher than in the first scenario. Now, I actually found exactly the same study as Guido Baldi, which is this study from these US economists, that these different simulations. And I also used these two scenarios. And now one difference between the high scenario and the low scenario is that in the high scenario, the administration actually undermines the credibility and the independence of the central bank. So that's not the only difference, but this is one of the differences. And now these curves here show you the difference of consumer price inflation relative to a baseline forecast. So this is not the actual value of inflation, but you should read this graph as if you have 7% here, then inflation would be 7 percentage points higher than it would have been without a Trump administration. But what this shows you is that in this high scenario, these economists expect over the Trump presidency a persistently higher inflation rate, up to 7 percentage points higher than it would have been otherwise. Now, in the low scenario, again, without the undermining of the central bank, things look a lot better, although still inflationary, so the policies still lead to an increase in prices, but the central bank responds much more strongly, keeps inflation much better in check, and here we just have, in double quotes, only a 4 percentage point higher inflation rate compared to this baseline scenario. Now, what does this mean for GDP? So this is actually now, I think there was a question before also about GDP, and you can see in both scenarios actually GDP will suffer. Now, what you can see here in the low scenario, you have initially an increase in GDP. This is mostly because of the reduction in taxes. But these economists actually judge that this increase in taxes will not boost the economy too much, but then the negative effects of the response of the central bank will kick in and GDP will then eventually decline. Now again, different policies are modeled here in the background. So there is much more behind these numbers, especially also what Guido Baldi talked about, the deportation policies, which will have a strong effect on GDP. But again, what you can see from both of these scenarios, what these scenarios imply are higher inflation and lower economic activity. So this is really not a very good outlook for the US economy under these two scenarios. Now, what's important is that, well, a scenario is not a forecast. We could actually make up many more scenarios. We could make up a scenario where actually Congress blocks everything, no policy is implemented, and we would have exactly the same outcome as without a Trump presidency. We could make up a scenario where there is an escalating global conflict, economic activity worldwide declines even much more than is predicted in these two scenarios. Now, if you want to make a forecast, you not only have to think about what the effect of a policy is, but you also have to think about, well, what is the probability that this policy will be implemented eventually? So kind of your best guess what the future will bring will consist of like a weighted average of different scenarios where you would weight these scenarios with the probability that they will actually come to pass. So this is kind of what I try to distinguish here. If you want to make a good guess of what will happen in the future, you would do something like what is called an unconditional forecast, so kind of the most likely outcome of future economic activity. And this is generally much more difficult to do than a conditional forecast, which is essentially such a scenario. So this would be a guess what will happen to the US economy if Trump implements all the policies that he talked about. But we heard also before that, well, maybe Trump just talks about these things in a kind of like random way, and what he then will implement is a completely different question. Now, how can we actually try to resolve this problem? How can we get at a good forecast what will happen? Now, one possibility is to look at expectations formed by financial market participants. Another possibility would be to look at forecasts by, say, professional forecasters. But the problem is these forecasts by professional forecasters, they are elicited with surveys, and usually that takes some time until we get the next numbers. So what I did here is now I assembled some financial market variables that should tell us something about the future evolution of interest rates, inflation, and the exchange rate. So the first graph here that you see, this is the 5-year real treasury yield. So in principle, this is the interest rate that you expect to earn if you hold an inflation-protected bond by the US government over 5 years. So in a sense, this is an interest rate with a maturity of 5 years. So in principle, this is roughly what financial market participants expect the interest rate to be on average over the next 5 years. Now, the nice thing about that is obviously that, well, the next 4 years are under President Trump, so this roughly covers his presidency. Now, what you can see is that, well, in the run-up to the election, we see a slight increase in this real interest rate. The last observation is 1.9%. What does this mean? This means that financial market participants expect the inflation-adjusted interest rate to be on average 1.9% over the next 5 years. So actually, they do not expect a sharp increase in the interest rate by the Federal Reserve over the next 5 years. They expect an interest rate that is roughly in line with the historical average. Now here you can see the interest rate was very low. This is essentially due to the COVID-19 crisis, but the normal interest rate that you observe in the United States, that is roughly around 1.9%. So financial market participants think, well, the Federal Reserve will actually not have to sharply increase interest rates over the next 5 years. Now, the exchange rate, that's a bit of that's more difficult to elicit. Actually, I didn't find a similar measure of 5-year ahead expectations. But what you can still see is that during the last couple of months, the exchange rate has strengthened. So an increase in this dollar index means that the dollar appreciates against the basket of currencies. Now, the last observation that I had when I constructed the presentation was 126. Now, the most recent value is even a little bit stronger, so at 127. So this suggests that, well, actually, the dollar appreciates. So this is still, to some extent, maybe a little bit puzzling, but financial markets still kind of are not in this scenario where they see that the central bank loses its independence, because then you would actually expect a depreciation of the currency. So at the moment, financial markets are not too worried about a scenario where the central bank really loses its independence and Trump pressures the central bank to keep interest rates lower than they would have been. And if we look now at inflation expectations, so here I show you a measure of the expected inflation rate over the next 5 years. Again, this is actually based on these inflation-protected bonds, because the inflation-protected bonds, they allow you to compute the real interest rate. Then you have bonds that are not protected against inflation, and the difference gives you a measure of inflation expectations. Again, I computed that for an average 5-year horizon, which covers roughly the Trump presidency. And again, you can see that, well, inflation expectations, they increased a little bit from around 2% to now 2.4%. This is a little bit higher, but it's certainly not anywhere close to these scenarios that have been modeled by the economists. So again, I do not say these scenarios are wrong from an economic perspective. I just say financial markets at the moment put probably an almost zero probability on these scenarios occurring. Now, of course, the open question is, are financial markets too optimistic? Is the danger that, the central bank conducts an inflationary policy, or that these policies are very inflationary, actually larger? That's, of course, an open question. I'm just saying, like, the best forecast that I have at the moment from financial markets, they do actually not point into the direction that inflation will increase strongly over the next 5 years. All right, so let me just conclude by talking a little bit about the implications for Swiss monetary policy. So we have seen that, well, at the moment financial markets are relatively calm, but they could be wrong, and inflation could be higher in the United States than what financial markets predict. Now, in the end, for Swiss monetary policy, that's not that big of an issue. The reason is that we have a flexible exchange rate, so the Swiss National Bank can implement an independent monetary policy from the United States. The S&B can increase interest rates on its own and basically stabilize inflation, even if inflation increases in the United States. And again, the experience that we had during the last 4 years is a perfect example of that, where inflation in Switzerland was around 3%, inflation in the United States and in Europe was around 10%, and basically the difference was compensated by an appreciating Swiss franc. Now, of course, again, the implication would be that the Swiss franc would strengthen in nominal terms. This is something that we observe, over the past, or basically since the 1970s. So as such, this is not much of a problem. But also it may at least temporarily imply a temporary strengthening of the Swiss franc in real terms. And of course, as you know, this can actually be challenging for the export industry. But again, on the other hand, the export industry in Switzerland is actually quite used to such a situation where the real Swiss franc actually becomes stronger temporarily. So in this sense, now for monetary policy, I'm quite optimistic that the Trump presidency will not be a huge problem. I rather see actually the challenges in other domains, in particular in the kind of international security and international conflicts. I think that will be much more challenging and a larger danger for Switzerland. But I also think that the Swiss National Bank knows very well how to deal with such situations where inflation is high abroad and inflation should be low in Switzerland, and therefore I'm not much worried that we have large inflationary spillovers to Switzerland in the years to come. All right, perfect. Thank you very much for your attention.
everyone. We're going to slightly move to our second section of questions and discussion. And I can also take questions from friends for those who feel comfortable. Is there anything?
Could the tariffs on China be beneficial for the EU in our trade relationship with them?
So if you say, okay, do you have so U.S. tariffs on China, whether they are beneficial then for us when we trade with the EU?
In regards to our own trading with China.
Yes, in principle that could be the case. I would say in principle that could be the case. I think you had a simulation like that where you have seen that actually some countries benefit from the introduction of tariffs on China because then, some other countries trade more with Switzerland. So that could be the case. But on the other hand, I would say, tariffs on the one hand, they're not like a zero-sum game, right? You do not just move the trade to other countries. Tariffs actually are like a friction in international trade. So it's very likely that economic activity falls overall. So I'm not sure whether actually Switzerland would gain in net terms because, the frictions in the international trading system would actually reduce overall economic activity as well. Yes, please.
I have one question. What do you think is going to be the impact of Trump presidency in terms of investment, in terms of global investment?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. A very good question. Again, so let me put it this way. On the one hand, if you have protectionism in general, then it could be that it's actually harmful for international investment because what you also need is, in the end, a lot of investment is due to international capital flows. So if you start to mess with the trade system in goods and services, it could be the case that country then also retaliate not only with tariffs, but also to some extent with capital controls. And if you start to do that, then it's quite likely, that it's bad for investment because, a US investor could not easily invest money in China or vice versa. But then again, I haven't heard about policies that talk about capital controls as such. But if you look at the history, you see that two actually often go with each other. Because if there's really a trade conflict, the next step that you can do if you don't want to increase tariffs even more is to think about capital controls. So yeah, I would not be very optimistic for international investment if the tariffs and the Trump presidency are as severe as outlined in these scenarios.
As both you and Baldi have said, the tariffs could potentially be very damaging for the global economy. Who are the winners here? Why are these policies being implemented? Why so high?
I think honestly, or at least, I do not know a lot of economists, or actually I do not know any economist that would say that there are clear winners if the US starts to impose tariffs at this scale that they announced. The reason is that, trade and globalization to some extent fosters economic activity. And then of course the question is, there are some countries that gain more, maybe also some countries that lose a little bit. But in my view, what the tariffs are directed to, in the case of the United States, are particular sectors within the United States. So I could imagine that this protectionism could help maybe some specific industries within the United States. So, the obvious target that the Trump administration has in mind is the manufacturing sector. So they want to create manufacturing jobs in the United States. And, these effects are very uncertain. So the studies that I know, they say that will probably not work. but there's a lot of uncertainty. So I could imagine that maybe some areas in the United States that are heavy in manufacturing, they will gain somewhat. But I think most countries as a whole will actually lose with these policies. Yes, please.
What I believe is that actually if Trump starts with his own taxes, that the BRICS will earn much more power than they have done.
Because the United States is not a reliable trading partner anymore, so you look for other
Alternatives.
groups of countries.
The money which Americans don't have. And the BRICS, they have all the countries inside which actually are against the West.
That
Iran, India, China, and there are more to come, and I believe the benefit will be to the BRICS.
I would say they will. I would put it differently. I would say they probably they are the ones that lose the least, because the point is that, well, these are also the countries that are actually the target of, or I mean, China is in the end the main target of the United States. I would say they will probably, maybe those are the countries that do not suffer that much. And also the other question is, if you impose tariffs on China, then we also see that with sanctions on Russia, maybe there are kind of ways around it, right? So maybe there are also ways to get around the tariffs by taking another country as intermediary, and maybe then the overall effect will not be that large. But what I definitely agree is that if the United States is not seen anymore as a reliable trading partner, this could really also change the power within the global economic system. I completely agree. Yeah. Yes.
When doing those inflation projections, is it worth looking at longer term maturities that are more sensitive? So, for example, 30-year US bonds yields were increasing despite the recent lowering of the rates in the US. So, isn't this like a measure that long-term inflation is going up?
A very good point. So I haven't looked at 30-year maturity because these are basically the average over the next 30 years. So what I said is that, well, the main effect will be during the Trump presidency. So that's the reason why I took the 5-year maturity. But it's an excellent point. I mean, we could do exactly the same with, I think we have 10, 20, and 30-year maturities for these tips. So absolutely, this is an excellent point. I should have a look at that. But I don't know the exact numbers from the top of my head.
Perfect. If not, I think we should sum up. Thank you once again.
You're very welcome.
And once again, in the name of Secomania, I would like to thank everyone for coming here today. You really honor us with your presence here. And I will invite you downstairs to have a small review. Come, have a